Yeah, and it's can be very frustrating. There's two things that Jill said there that I want to touch upon further. One, sometimes, as we see also separate and apart with a lot of children who are the autism spectrums, they'll sometimes get called out for not paying attention. But when you ask them a question, they actually can answer the question right away. And that's something that can be very frustrating for the child, because they feel like, why am I getting in trouble or dinged for this? Yeah, I'm moving, I'm fidgeting, I'm bouncing around, but I'm following along. And I can answer your question. Sometimes to the same degree as any other child in the room who doesn't have a challenge with focus or attention. Sometimes lessened, but still able to generally hang tough and be able to keep pace with the classroom. So that's an emotional challenge for children with primarily hyperactive type. Something else is key that Jill said that reminded me of a child I used to work with, or many children I used to work with, but one in particular. It's exhausting. It's exhausting work for these children to try to stay in one place. As Jill said, and when she said, a child was almost vibrating in their seat, I remember one young lady I used to work with when I used to work in a high school. And for her to sit still, for her to get up and walk around, it was not tiring for her. It was actually helpful for her to get up and move and listen and kind of, if she were an adult, she would be like me on the conference call on a speakerphone, walking around outside, taking a call that's, on foot. That's how I focus the best on difficult calls. But it's physically exhausting sometimes to force someone who's overactive to just stay in one place. So it can be physically exhausting, and it's also mentally exhausting. So, I say that because I don't want our kiddos who are primarily hyperactive type, to get blamed or to have a blame put on them. Well, you're just lazy. What, you've been sitting there all day. How could you be so tired? You're saying you're exhausted right now. You haven't moved from your desk. Sometimes that's harder for them to do. So just keep that in mind if you're a parent or a teacher. A little bit of understanding really goes a long way in building a better relationship with these kids, whether you're a mom or a dad or a grandparent, or you're a teacher. So the next type is the inattentive type. As the name says, primarily inattentive. They struggle to pay attention. They're oftentimes not overly active or disruptive. They tend to go unnoticed more so than their counterparts who are primarily hyperactive or who are combined type. One thing to be aware of, particularly in terms of people who get overlooked, the female population is, in my opinion, and with some data that we also have here at Revive, they are more oftentimes overlooked in a classroom setting, not intentionally, but because females tend to just follow the rules a little bit better than their male counterparts at the same age. They tend to just sit there, and if they're inattentive, they're not causing any problems. They're not requiring a lot of teacher assistance or correction, if you will. And a lot of times the teacher is just not to their fault, but just if you're sitting there and you're just not paying attention and you're not causing any problems, whether you're a male or female, you're going to get overlooked. But a lot of the times, there's been some research that's shown that females are even more than inattentive males overlooked, and then there tend to be more challenges for them. So they, in my opinion, in my experience, tend to be figured out and helped later on than their male counterparts of the same age, which is frustrating for the females and for their families. We tend to get more girls and young ladies coming to use our products than we technically on paper, by the diagnostic ratios of boys to girls, than we should. And in my opinion, it's because a lot of parents are actually saying, my daughter's struggling, and I'm not hearing a lot of feedback from school about it, but we know that she's having a harder time because it's at home she's really able to do X, Y, and Z. She or he, for that matter, does a great job on things that are of interest to them, so they should be able to focus a little bit more than we're getting from school. So just be aware of those things. And Jill, can you share some of your insight and experience with this group of children?
Yes. So like Rich was saying, they do tend to get, they're not as easily noticed, kids with inattentive type, because if they're in a classroom with someone that's hyperactive, a lot of that energy and movement is going to be picked up on first, and then you're also sorting out how much of it is them being distracted by that kind of activity in the classroom. But what I wanted to say is these are your kids who, like, you call on them and you're trying to sort out, is it that they don't know the answer because they weren't paying attention, or they don't understand the material? So that's a piece of it too as well. And then these are also your kids who are not turning in work or not finishing work, losing things. These are the kiddos that, their locker, backpack, whatever working area is generally, what we would call in the professional world a hot mess. Everything's kind of everywhere. They're not very organized. They have a hard time finding things. They may have started work. They're having trouble even just finding what they've already started. So, it's just kind of scattered, and they're not able to, complete tasks. It's kind of what we generally see in the classroom.
A great example of hyperactive type versus attentive type, myself and one of my siblings, my sibling was identified in first grade as having ADHD, very early, very active, very noticeable. I was never picked up on at all. I was, primarily inattentive in my own experience. So I kind of slipped through the cracks, right through college, right through grad school, until I started to learn about ADHD, what it was, and symptomology behind it. So that's just something to keep in mind, just because you're not getting, behavioral reports from school, hey, he or she's getting up a lot, he or she needs to be redirected. Do be aware, if you're listening to this and you're attending today, there's probably some suspicion that you have that your child may or may not, be a candidate to be evaluated or screened for ADHD. So don't be put off by just the fact that there are children who are less, movement oriented than others. So let's keep going. So combined type, this is essentially both. You're showing both categories, and this is, the more common diagnosis for ADHD. You have both, and as Jill said, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to have either type. So it's certainly, as you can imagine, a challenge to have both types. You have a hard time focusing, and you can't really stay in one place, or you're wanting to move around, as if you're powered by a motor, was what at least the DSM-4 symptomology was listed as for ADHD as one of the symptoms. Jill, can you share, anything else that you think of that may be helpful for parents in understanding the combined type as far as what you see in a classroom?
Yeah, like you said, these are the kids who they're struggling to stay in their seat. It's kind of a perfect storm of, they are having trouble staying still. They're having trouble being organized. They're having trouble paying attention. So these are the kiddos who, sometimes seem to be struggling the most. A lot of times these kiddos, have, especially as they get older, will verbalize, like, I want to do the work. I'm trying to do my work. I started my work. I don't know where my work is. And there's no telling where their work could be. I've worked with kids that their work ends up in a random different place in the classroom where it shouldn't have been, because they left their working area. And they, if you could track their footsteps throughout the classroom in a day, you would be amazed at all the little corners that they've gone into and all the circles they walked and things like that. So trying to help them sort out where they put that work that they've started can certainly be challenging, and trying to find ways to help them, to be able to stay focused during instruction. And to be able to work towards regulating that for themselves as much as they can as they're getting older.
I'll also add, there's a big emotional concept here around ADHD. There's a lot of things which we won't really touch upon very much today, but there are things called comorbid conditions, which is a fancy way of saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. When we typically see kids who have a diagnosis of X, we a lot of times will also see them have a diagnosis of Y, meaning that it's a comorbid condition. They're typically kind of like, whenever you watch Mickey Mouse cartoons, Minnie and Goofy and Pluto usually always make an appearance. So it's kind of the same train of thought around where there's one, there's usually the other. So ADHD is a very emotional type of challenge, where it goes way beyond just the fact that they can't focus and pay attention. Oftentimes there's these other things that are there. There's more, frustration. There's a lower frustration tolerance. Sometimes there are motor skill challenges that go along with ADHD. But on top of everything else, when you look at the end of the day, how this impacts these children, you'll tend to see as a parent and certainly as a professional that these kids tend after a while to start to get a bad rap from other people, but also from themselves. They give themselves a bad rap. Their self-esteem starts to go down. They start to become, in the mindset of, I can't do this. And it becomes what we call in psychology a self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning if you think you can't, you truly will not be able to. A great example, very briefly, is if someone thinks that no one likes them. If you move into a neighborhood and you're brand new and you think that all of your neighbors don't like you, when you see them and they go, and you kind of go, turn your head, the next time that person sees you, they're not going to be very nice. And they're going to tell the other neighbors that, hey, they're not very polite. You may not want to socialize with them. And before you know it, when you see all the other neighbors, you wave to them and you don't get the return. And that's because what you did yourself back channeled all this other activity that's happened. And so it's precluding you from becoming a well-liked person because you put that out there to begin with. And so we see that happen with kids, particularly with ADHD, in terms of when I think I can't. And then you get a spiral that happens and they feel like they're in this large hole that, in their mind that they've dug, where I can't do it. The other kids are having no problem. It started in first grade or kindergarten, and now I'm in second or third grade, and I'm behind in my reading, I'm behind in my math, and it truly does start to compound. So you will see them start to feel like they cannot do it. And truly, they are probably behind the eight ball, at least in what I call crystallized knowledge, meaning knowledge that they've been explicitly taught that you wouldn't know. Like the surface of the sun is 52 billion degrees or some kind of a made up thing like that I just came up with. But you wouldn't know that. You can't figure that out. It's not fluid intelligence where you can just kind of look and say, well, I get this Rubik's Cube should just look like this. And if I do this, I can figure it out. So these kids really do get behind the eight ball, which is why it's important to talk to your pediatricians, to talk to your school staff if you think you have a concern for ADHD, because the longer you wait, the more challenging getting caught up becomes. Jill, and I'm going a little bit off script, but I think it's important. Jill, can you talk a little bit about what you've seen for when parents have had that aha moment or their pediatricians have had that and they go, we figured out what it is?
As far as, I'm sorry. So like as far as just what that looks like, or
I guess as far as once kids start getting help, whether it's through an IEP or it's help through whether it's medication or it's a behavioral intervention or it's an academic intervention, once they start to get help that's, tailored for their actual challenges, if it really is ADHD. Now, can you talk about some of the changes that you've seen in kids who get back on track?
Certainly. So, I mean, like Rich said, I've certainly worked with kids who are behind the eight ball, who are, at least a grade level or two behind. And it's not overnight that everything, tends to catch up. But it makes a huge difference. They're able to start making those gains. They start to see and feel success. And know just, if it's a child who is receiving special education, they know that they have that other person, that other teacher that's kind of in their corner, that's working with them and supporting them in what they need. And that's one of the things about being a special education teacher that on one hand makes me feel really good, but on the other hand can be kind of heartbreaking, is when you have kiddos that you start working with and they are coming in with that negative self-talk and that negative self-attitude and just coming in from a really low place. It's great when you see that improve, but to start there, it's heartbreaking. But I think that to me is the second biggest piece of what I do, is that I am helping kids make gains and with the goal of trying to catch up academically, but to tell them, no, you can do this. I've seen what you can do. I know how smart you are. This has nothing to do with how smart you are. You just need some extra help. Everybody needs help with different things. Everybody has different skills. You don't always know until you get older what somebody else has needed support with. But just working on building up their self-esteem. I've had, over the years, I've had kids that have come in that I have literally sat with a student while he struggled to sound out words, just simple consonant, vowel, consonant words. I've literally sat next to a student and rubbed his back I know I need to do this this assessment to just kind of see where you're at. I know it's tough, but you're going to do great. You just do the best you can. And literally have, rubbed it back with one hand and filled out, paperwork for another to document where I was at. So, and that particular child is a child that, was actually able to exit special education services a couple of years later. So again, it doesn't always happen that way, but I think if you get the right mix of things, you can certainly see substantial gains and improvement for the child, depending on, what the course of treatment per se is, whether that's medication or something like the Revive Connect, an IEP, a 504, just the right combination of teacher and parent interaction. A lot of things, play into that. But it can definitely be a game changer for students who struggle, to stay focused and to struggle just staying in their area.
That was awesome. And I actually jotted in a few notes I want to talk about at the end if we have some time, that I think will be really helpful for parents and important to hear. So Joe, that was awesome and really got me thinking. I hope it got a lot of the parents at home thinking as well. So how do these forms show themselves through behavior? So we'll see kids in elementary school in terms of signs and symptoms struggle with staying in their seat or their area. And again, this particular bullet point, is certainly developmental. It's developmentally important to understand where your child is at. If they're in kindergarten, the expectation should certainly be different than if they're in 6th or 7th grade in terms of staying in their seat, moving around, having the wiggles, things like that. Fidgeting, again, same thing. Little kids, young children are certainly more fidgety and more wiggly in the classroom. So just because somebody's fidgety or wiggly and they're 5 or 6 years old doesn't necessarily mean that they have ADHD. But again, look for things big picture, and never be afraid to talk to your pediatrician or teachers. But taking turns, letting others speak, which is kind of code for impulsivity. If someone is either so animated or so, in some cases, hyperactive, that they have a hard time stopping long enough to let someone get a word in edgewise, there may be some concerns. Taking turns, again, having that ability to self-regulate and to say, okay, let me stop for a minute, and maybe now it's your turn. Again, developmental appropriateness is important here. 5 and 6 years old, we're all working on that, right? ADHD or not. Completing tasks is probably one of the biggest things that I recall from my days as a psychologist in a school system, because that's what school's generally all about. Can you sit and listen to pull new information in, and can you then complete tasks that are necessary to demonstrate your new knowledge? And then, as we have at the bottom here, as I mentioned earlier, managing emotions. It's certainly a little bit more challenging sometimes for some kids with ADHD, have a lower frustration tolerance, and they get into situations that are more frustrating than somebody maybe who's, as we say, neurotypically developed, or somebody without ADHD. They just find themselves, myself included, just find ourselves in more of a pickle more often than kids who are able to focus, because all of a sudden, teacher's talking, and all of a sudden you go, what was that? Was that a Mustang outside? That sounded pretty cool. Or was that a bird? And then all of a sudden you find yourself, and the teacher says, Rich, what are your thoughts? And you go, oh. And now you're defensive. People are looking at me. People think I'm not able to listen. I get my name called all the time. So that's what I recall seeing. Jill, can you chime in on anything that we just hit on some of these bullet points?
What your comment about the Mustang made me smile. It made me think about if your classroom has a lot of windows and you hear emergency vehicles go by. That's a time when you lose lots of the boys. I think whether they have ADHD or not. You hear the fire truck or the ambulance or whatever. Everybody goes running to the window. But yeah, I think definitely this is a good summarization of kind of what we see. And again, what Rich said about things being developmentally appropriate. A lot of the focus in kindergarten is in learning to stay in your seat or area, understanding what your area is. So working on, sitting, crisscross applesauce, hands in your lap, not touching others. All that has to be taught and retaught and modeled. And just because that's not coming quickly or easily for your child doesn't necessarily mean that they have ADHD. It's, there's a developmental range of appropriateness. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. I think it's more when you're getting closer to the end of kindergarten, and you're seeing the general population is kind of sitting on the carpet, they're listening to the teacher, and you have, a kiddo who is not able to sit on the carpet, or they're up walking around the room, or they're still interrupting the teacher. Those things that have been being worked on, for almost the whole school year, that you're still seeing that they're really struggling with those. That's kind of more of a red flag. And then, in the upper grades, again, these are things that we continue to see. The fidgeting, I think one thing to keep in mind, I know a lot of people are virtual right now. I think we're probably seeing an increase in fidgeting because so much time is being spent in front of screens. So I think keeping that in mind and what's appropriate, and I know we're kind of going to talk about that a little bit more too. Thinking about you as an adult, how many times are you like picking up your phone and looking at your phone just because it's right there and you can? But kind of thinking about those kinds of things, that I think we are seeing an increase in that. And sometimes fidgeting just happens. A child may be doing that as a way to help alert themselves, to help them to better attend to instruction. And just thinking about what's the context of the fidgeting. Is it a time when, when a child may not be as interested, whether that's in school or out of school, that they may be fidgeting to try to help themselves stay alert, to keep themselves engaged.
And as Jill said, we will talk a little bit more about fidgeting, and about some of the other points. Want to just make sure that we get through our whole presentation, but I think there's a couple of things that I'd love for Jill and I to expound upon a little bit at the end if we have some time. One thing I wanted to add, we were talking about middle school and high school, something that can look like ADHD, and there's a lot of people who are super defensive about, there's too many kids diagnosed with ADHD. We have to be super mega critical. No one should be ADHD unless, they've passed 600 different types of assessments. So yes, always be careful. We don't want to assign diagnoses to kids who are not really ADHD, of course. But I think it's one thing that's really important from a safety perspective as you get into middle school and high school, is you'll sometimes get kids who struggle to focus, and maybe that's new. Maybe they haven't had those issues when they were younger. Sometimes other things will present themselves as a difficulty with focus, but the etiology of the problem is really from somewhere else. It could be from something like depression. So if you get, it could be any age. I've seen children, who have various challenges at all ages, but when you get to middle school and high school, it's more common in my experience to start to see kids who are suffering from depression, and that can look like a focus and an attention issue. So again, talk to your pediatrician, talk to your school staff, but make sure to include, your physician in the mix, because that's certainly an important safety issue to make sure when your child may be looking at depression. But middle school, daydreaming, lack of motivation, lack of organization, and forgetfulness. Now, some of this just kind of comes, with kids who are going through puberty. So this is a little bit harder sometimes to rule out, especially when it comes to forgetfulness. They have a lot on their mind. They're talking about hanging out and clubs and sports and, riding bikes, places they've never been allowed to go to before. But again, when you start to get some things like lack of motivation, failure to want to engage in things that were previously fun or exciting, that could just be middle school, where I'm not a baby anymore. I don't want to play wiffle ball on the lawn with you anymore, mom and dad. Or again, it could be a feature of something like depression. So definitely, don't take things lightly. Depression is something where I'm always a big advocate of parents erring on the side of caution. I've had quite a few people that I've been fortunate enough to intervene with, where the parents have called me up and said, I didn't take you seriously when you first called me, but I'm glad we did everything we did because we saved my child yesterday. we found out X, Y, and Z when we got home, or we went to the doctor or the hospital, or wherever it may be. So just keep that in mind when you're ruling some of these things out at any age, but particularly middle school and high school. Jill, do you have any thoughts about middle school? And I'm going to click one forward to high school just to add a couple more, and then we can put them together. So impulsive behavior, lack of time management, and risky driving.
Yes, I like that you talked about the depression piece. Just middle school, the kids are a different kind of animal. I have a middle schooler now and a child who just became a high schooler. So I live and breathe this, but they have all these new feelings and everything because of going through puberty. Everything just changes for them. And so there's, definitely some pulling away. There's pulling away from us as parents, and there's new friends that you've never heard of, and there's new interests and things like that. So it's a matter of sorting out where the lines are of puberty, and if there's possible depression, or if there are signs of ADHD that maybe haven't been picked up on before. So I think it's really great what Rich said about, definitely talking with your pediatrician, also always talking with their child's teachers. What are you seeing in the classroom? What are you seeing with peer interactions at school? Has there been anything concerning there? As well as, what their work looks like in the classroom, their classwork, whether or not they're turning in homework, those kinds of things. Yeah.
I'm going to actually read some of these bullet points because our team's done a great job putting together this presentation, and I'm realizing that I'm skipping over a couple of things that are really, really good. So in terms of impulsive behaviors, a teenager with ADHD may begin to take more risks and seek more thrills in their everyday life as they jump to thoughts or actions at a rapid pace, which again is a feature of impulsivity. Time management, ability to keep a schedule, may be an issue as forgetfulness starts to kick in. And then, of course, driving. There's been a lot of studies about ADHD and driving. 2 to 4 times more likely to have an accident than a teen without ADHD. So certainly make sure that you're doing a good job teaching those skills and situational awareness on the road. But the time management piece I wanted to touch upon, especially middle school and high school, this is something called executive functioning. And executive functioning is just what the name sounds like. If you're an executive of a company, you're tasked with having to do lots of different things and to keep them in your head. And then you have to just execute on this. And then I have to remember that this is coming up later today, so I have to execute on that. And then, oh yeah, this is not due until next week, but I have to start on it right now. Kids with ADHD and teenagers with ADHD tend to have a harder time with that type of thinking, that kind of cognitive. I used to explain it when I was a school psychologist as a tray. How big is your tray? If you're a waiter or a waitress, how many cups and plates and forks can you hold on your plate before things start to fall off? If you have a smaller, working memory, and if you have your executive functioning is impacted by working memory, you're going to have a harder time remembering things and planning things that you do remember to actually take part of. So this can make it really hard for these folks with ADHD because if you're not taking in all the same information that your peers are getting, then you're not able, in some cases, to remember it as well, and then you're not able to actually organize and execute those thoughts. You can see where it's really hard for some people with ADHD to perform in a school environment as well as somebody without ADHD. And that is not to say that they cannot perform, because I do believe ADHD is a secret superpower, and we have a whole webinar about that. Check it out for parents and for kids to really let them know that, hey, you can harness this ability and you can use it to your advantage. But without that awareness, without knowing that that's what it is, you wouldn't know what you have to work on and be aware of. So that's where, and we'll talk about diagnosis later on. Some people hate putting a label on things. Some people love putting a label on things. But at least if you know what you're up against and you know what you can potentially call it and how it potentially works, it gives you more power to be able to take control of it and to really put yourself in a place of success. So here we go. How do you know if it's ADHD or situational? So there's no actual blood test. This blows people's minds. There's no blood test for ADHD. One of our strategic partner, I'll give them a shout out, is a company called Multi Health Systems, and we work very closely with MHS. They are a partner of ours. They're an investor of ours. They put out what I believe to be probably the best ADHD measure in the world. It's called the Connors assessment. for ADHD. And there's different versions and iterations of the Conners. But that is, things like the Conners are the way that you diagnose ADHD. I mean, if you're curious how the process works and who can do it, we'll unpack this a little bit. But basically, you can't go in to say, draw my child's blood and tell me if they have ADHD. You can do that for almost everything else, but not this. And that's confusing for people, including doctors. A lot of doctors have a really hard time or are uncomfortable diagnosing ADHD because I used to say it's like catching air with a butterfly net. You know, it's tricky. So as a parent, they'll ask you a lot of questions. They'll base these questions on the DSM-5 now. And measures like the Conners are keyed into some of these industry standards, for diagnosis like the DSM, where they'll base the questions both asked by your physician and also give you these things called rating scales, such as the Conners, that'll say from 0 to 5, please circle how active is your child? How do they do when you ask them this? On a scale of 1 to 5, how much difficulty do they have doing that? And they'll give 1 to you, or 2 to the parent, 1 or 2 to the parents. So either have a 1 or 2 caretakers fill out the Conners for the parent form. And they'll also typically give 1 to the teacher or teachers. And then sometimes they have the child themselves, depending upon their age, complete 1 as well. And then they'll take this information from something like the Conners. They'll take information of talking to you. They'll meet your child. And typically they will make it a diagnosis based on tools such as that. But it's a lot of detective work. It's a lot of sleuthing to figure out, do I think this is ADHD? In a lot of cases, it's not extremely complicated when kids who are more overtly hyperactive or who, you report are just extraordinarily inattentive and it's been that way forever. But there are some tricky cases, and they'll do what's called an RO, or a rule out, to try to rule out if is it depression, is it this, or is it that? But that's the basic premise of how a diagnosis works from the clinical perspective. As far as who does the diagnosis, it depends upon where you live in the country, as far as what your school will consider. I'd love for Jill in a moment to talk to us about what her understanding currently of the school systems are, at least in North Carolina here. But generally speaking, somebody a lot of folks will assist in a diagnosis. So your school psychologist will likely collect data, do an observation in the classroom, include that in the psych report. If you have an assessment done, they'll collect data from the Conners. They typically won't actually make a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis. Even PhD psychologists, depending upon what it's used for, you may need an MD, either a pediatrician, a GP, a psychiatrist, to make a diagnosis, depending upon how it's going to be used. And that's not to say that a psychologist cannot make a diagnosis, but back when I was young and I worked in the school system, for us to utilize that diagnosis to say get special education placement under OHI, which is another health impairment, at the time we needed for the person to have an MD after their name rather than a PhD, even though they may have been diagnosed by a PhD. Jill, how does that work these days? It's been about 5 or 6 years for me.
Yes, so it's stayed the same, that when we are evaluating a child, that piece is on the parent to get the medical report and take the child to the doctor. And we are looking for something from a pediatrician or a medical doctor that states that the child has been diagnosed with ADHD. So that hasn't changed from that perspective.
So how do you tell during COVID? Virtual learning, has made it very challenging, particularly for teachers, I think, to really get a good sense, in my opinion, even of just who your students are, right? Teachers really pride themselves on getting to know their kids. I call them their kids. They're students who they often regard as their children. They become friendly, they become friends in some regard, some manner. As Jill said, there's a tremendous amount of care that goes in to becoming a teacher, that you build a relationship with your student. And oftentimes teachers are amazingly helpful when you, the parent, have questions about, do you think it's a focus and attention issue? Should we investigate? Because they've probably been doing it for a little while, maybe a long time. and B, it's something that they commonly see. But it is not commonly seen through a computer where the child's at home and you can't see what they're doing. You can't, keep eyes on them at all times. It's a truncated school day for a lot of kids. It's not a full 8 hours. So, so I'll rattle through these, and I'd love to hear what Jill's experience has been so far. But some of the questions to ask, may be helpful around, were there issues before the current school year? Oftentimes, ADHD doesn't just materialize out of nowhere. It's often, present for some time. Has structure been created? How does a child do with structure? That's a whole nother ballgame as far as we have a separate video for tips you can use to create structure to help your child learn at home with focusing issues. But some things, how do they respond to a checklist? How do they work when you increase their structure? This is something that we've seen. One of the folks on our scientific and medical advisory board, was actually, has been key in working with a lot of different pharmacological agencies. And we hear things like, sometimes, whether they should or they shouldn't, physicians will sometimes put the cart before the horse, and they'll put a child on meds to see, does it help them? Hey, it must be ADHD. So, you can take something like that, which, is certainly questionable in terms of best practice, but you can try to put some things in place for a child to see, not necessarily, in my opinion, if they have or do not have ADHD, but do they have something to the level that requires you to go and seek an intervention or to seek a diagnosis? We're all about least restrictive environments. So if you can create measures in your home, such as creating a schedule, a list of activities, bring some structure in, create a workspace that's clean and uncluttered. See how the child responds. It's helpful to be able to share that with whomever is making a potential diagnosis. And finally, is it affecting areas outside of school? So we call this global, the general theme is kind of global functioning in psychology. Is this only affecting the child in terms of when they're at school, or do you notice that when they're eating dinner, perhaps they're getting up, walking around a lot, and you have to say, please stay in your seat. Why are you, cleaning your sneakers in the middle of eating your mashed potatoes? Please sit down. So if you see it in multiple places, how do they do with peers? How do they do in terms of stopping? When you say, stop hitting your brother, stop hitting your brother, stop hitting your brother. How do they do with that? Does it take 5 times? So Jill, I would love to shush myself up for a moment. How have you been seeing this and dealing with both helping parents who maybe have asked you questions about focus and attention during Learn from Home? What's been your experience so far?
So thankfully, my experience so far this school year has been that no parents have asked me if I think their child has troubles with focusing, which I'm grateful for, because like you said, with being virtual right now and having new students to me, it's very hard to know for a number of reasons. And being special education, typically the students that I'm working with have already been diagnosed and have already receiving special education services, or they're students that have been referred that are being evaluated currently. But there has not been a lot of that so far this year, and I think a lot of it just is because of virtual. But my experience with virtual learning is that at least in our I can't think of the word right now, at least in our school system, our students are not required to turn on their cameras for some reasons that I agree with. I understand why, but they're not required to turn on their cameras. So we spend a good bit of our time asking questions and waiting for a response. And so sometimes, it's kind of like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You're like, Bueller, and we're calling on students by name, because a lot of times you have 1 or 2 students that will answer questions, and then pretty much everybody else hangs back. So specifically calling on students and then trying to get a response and trying to see if they're going to unmute and they're going to answer that way, or if they're going to put an answer in the chat box, and then trying to tease out if those students are even in the instruction, because I've had some instances where I'm pretty sure that students have logged into instruction and then have gone to do other activities. speculating here, but maybe things like playing video games or being on phones or whatever, because the class will even end and they haven't left the Google Meet. So things like that. So trying to being able to sort out whether or not you're truly having attention issues that are because of ADHD or it's just because of the environment is really hard if you don't already know that student. So I think that's when it's really crucial to go back to the previous year's teachers and say, before COVID, when we were, in school and traditional instruction, were you seeing any concerns? Was there anything for you? Because I think right now we're just seeing a lot more opportunities for students to be distracted because a lot of students are at home. And so I've had students try to, bring their dogs and have them on camera. You're in the middle of teaching and all of a sudden they've turned their camera on and like there's a dog face in the screen. And these are not necessarily kiddos who do have ADHD. It's also that line of pushing the limits of what can I get away with? Maybe we can turn this lesson into a little bit of show and tell, that kind of thing. The other thing that I wanted to say too about this is that not only is it important to make sure that your child has the structures that they need, but to teach them how to use it. And I know with the curriculum that's taught, there's no part of any curriculum in math, science, reading, any of that, where you teach children how to use a schedule or how to use a checklist. That's something that I know some teachers have built into how they set up their classroom, certainly, but it's not a huge focus. So I think that's something that we as parents have to remember too, that we can't just give our kids a schedule or just give them a to-do list and then expect things to magically happen. They need to be taught how to read the schedule and understand what it means, and how to use it, and how to have a game plan as far as things that are set for certain times, how they're going to manage that piece of it. Are they going to use their watch? Are they going to set alarms on their watch? Are they using a Connect and having reminders there? Are they going to use Alexa or Google Home to set up like a bell system? But making sure that they have those structures in place and they really truly know how to use it, because if they don't really have the ability to use it or the understanding to use it, then it's not really a tool, and it's not going to be helpful to them.
It's great input. And as Jill said, yeah, we don't talk about our products on webinars, but we do mention things where a lot of times there's not a lot of tools. So as Jill said, there is certain features of our Revive Connect that are helpful when it comes to creating some structure at home with a schedule, with a reminder, homework mode, things like that. So, but there's also a really good tool that we have that's completely free. That's just a planner on our website that you can download and print out. And it's really helpful. That's a key for kids at home. We think during COVID is just creating that structure. Kids tend to do better in school generally than home when it comes to executing work, because school's built to be a very rigid, compartmentalized, structured, setting. And at home, it's designed to be leisurely and relaxing and to let us, kick up our feet and let our hair down. So that's why a lot of kids with ADHD in particular are really struggling during the school at home. So, get creative, watch some of our webinars, learn more about the tips and tricks you can do to set your child up for success as much as possible in the home setting. So let's keep moving. We're almost done here. So if you see these behaviors, perfect segue. So there's a lot of different things you can do for ADHD. The first step, as we say, is always talk to your physician, get some feedback from your doctor. Sometimes they'll say, look, I'm not so comfortable with ADHD. Talk to the psychologist and they'll refer you. And that's not because they don't care or because they're trying to pass you around or because there's some kind of a commission-based system. But a lot of physicians, we've talked to physicians, we're partnered with a few in the area. They'll tell you it's hard to diagnose, and to do a confident job diagnosing this thing that's very descriptive and less, physical, if you will. There's not a blood test that shows it. I have to really do some discovery. And it's psychologists generally do a really good job because it's a big part of what we do. But always, first step, always talk to your physician, talk to your school, talk to the school psychologist. It's a really good place to start. In terms of some other things that are great, helpful tools. As Jill mentioned, she is a special education teacher, and special education for those kids who need it, I think, is a absolute blessing, and it can really set kids up for success. It creates a lot of even additional structure and additional support on top of whatever you're providing, from a naturalistic school setting. So there's something called an IEP, which we won't get into today. We have some webinars about that as well. An individualized education plan, which comes, as a customized document. It's a legal document for kids who are served under special education, which a lot of kids with ADHD are, not all, but many. 504 is another thing and another legal document. And there's also something we use called the response to intervention process, which helps us figure out, what direction to go and what interventions are good. But as you can see, we have some great, videos that have been put out by Jill before through our platform. So be sure to check that out. A couple more things I want to hit on. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A. I just wanted to say this because my heart goes out to all the kids with focus and attention issues. Whether or not they're labeled ADHD or they've been diagnosed or not. These kids typically want to do well. And I always say this when we do webinars. They sometimes get a bad rap. They sometimes, especially when you get into older kids, late elementary, middle, and high school kids, they'll tend to come off in some cases as a little bit more, defiant or bitter about school, or I can't do it, or leave me alone, or don't call my name out. And it's not, in my opinion, in my experience, it's not because that's how they were born. That's not how they were when they were younger. That's something most of these kids have learned because of the situation that they're faced with. They felt a lack of success and a lack of positive light on them just because they haven't been able to do as well as the kids to their left and to their right. They hear their name called out a lot, and it's not because they're saying, Jonathan, you're an all-star. It's you're saying, Jonathan, you need to get back to work. Jonathan, focus. And that tends to take its toll on kids, and they become a little bit, testy. Jonathan, what? Well, good job. I like your shirt today. Oh, that's Jonathan. He's really testy. No, you'd be testy too if, you've had your name called out 46,000 times since kindergarten, and now you're in 9th grade. So I just want people, parents and teachers and caregivers, to understand that once these kids, in a lot of cases, in so many I've worked with, and I'm sure a lot with Jill as well, when these kids get a little ray of sunshine and a little experience of success, it is infectious and they love it. And even though they won't show it, maybe they won't show their hand at first, you start to see it positively compound, meaning I did a little bit better. I like that. I want more praise. I want more positivity. So catch them being good. Any chance you have to compliment these kids is really important. One more thing I wanted to say, and then we'll see if there's any questions. I used to hear this a lot, particularly fellas. I'm a guy too, so I'm not bashing the guys, but from a lot of the dads in particular, I would hear this pushback. One of the parents might say, hey, I think there's an attention concern, or the school would say we think there's a focus concern. And a lot of the times, a parent, a lot of times it was the dad, would say, nah, no way. That's a bunch of bunk. I've seen this child, this young lady or this young man, focus really well on Roblox or on Minecraft. They can play X, Y, and Z game or read this magazine or this book or this activity for hours on end. Clearly, they don't have a focusing issue. It's their choice. Completely untrue. A unique aspect of ADHD is it allows, this is where the superpower comes in, I mentioned earlier. It allows you to hyper-focus on things that are easier or interesting, and a lot of times makes it more difficult to focus on things that are harder, or the battle becomes more uphill. So don't write off the fact that it could be a focusing issue, it could be ADHD, even though the child may focus really, really well on some things. So with that, Jill, did you have any final parting words before we turn it over to Q&A?
I was just going to say, I love what you said about all of it, the self-fulfilling prophecy. We definitely see that, and what you were saying about kids and their names being called and the reactions that you get. And sometimes you get that defiance. And I do see that. And I feel like you you get out of kids what you put into them. And there are certainly students that, get a reputation from year to year. And my goal as an educator is it's a new year. Every day, forget that. Every day is a blank slate. Every day you start over. What happened yesterday happened yesterday. Like, we're here, we're in the here and now. And like, I know you're going to have a great day. So a lot of what I do is just like talking my kids up and like setting them up for success and saying like, you're going to have a great day today. Like, what do you need to get done? Okay, let's come up with a plan. Like, this is going to be great. And breaking things down for them in a way that you know that you're setting them up for success, so that they're going to, like Rich said, they're going to start to get those small nibbles of success, and then they want more and they feel more confident. And you see, as time goes on, the defiance, the frustration, the irritability definitely, fades away, which is great. And those kids, make such a great turnaround, and because they feel successful. They didn't, just didn't feel successful before, and they did look to the left and look to the right and see what their peers were doing, and it seems like it's so easy for them, and they don't have that experience. So I 110% agree with that.
Jill, you hit on something that really struck a positive chord with me that I want to share. One more thing, even though I said I wouldn't, but it really just lit something up inside of my mind and my heart. Parents, most of the people on this webinar, both viewing it live and viewing it later, are probably here because you have a child you have a concern about. Try this. I challenge you to try this next time that your child is doing something that you find yourself upset about. There's a lot of challenge for both parent and child, and also parent and parent cause marital challenges too, to have a child with some kind of a challenge or disability. So keep that in mind, but I challenge you to learn a little bit about ADHD. Think about what we talked about today. And next time you go to yell and you do the finger point, which is natural, doesn't make you a bad person, it can be frustrating and challenging for sure. But before you open your mouth to reprimand or to yell, ask yourself, could this behavior that they're doing, which is driving me crazy, or their siblings nuts, could this be a function of ADHD? And if it is, it may be something that they can't help. And when you go to say to yourself, well, they should just flip it around for a second and say, would I give the same reaction I'm going to give right now of frustration if we were outside running as a family and my child had asthma and they fell behind and they were breathing heavy and I said, just hurry it up? Would I do that if they couldn't breathe because of asthma? It's like breathing through a straw. I probably wouldn't. And that will help you start to put yourself in a better position to have a better relationship with your child, which is the first starting point at really helping them start to build themselves back up. So with that, let us pause and see if you have any questions for Jill or for myself. And we will let Morgan check the chat page, and I will see if I can check that as well.
Sure. So we just had a question about the presentation being available later to view. And yes, absolutely. We'll be sending that out. And then also, so that was Michelle. And then Leslie was asking about a gadget to help teens focus and concentrate. So if you potentially want to talk a little bit more about Revibe for a second. And she also asked where she can get the planner. That is on our website, on our blog, and I can include it in the email that has the recording as well. Leslie also asked if she should inform her teachers or her daughter's teachers that she has ADHD. So if you want to just start off with the gadget question and informing teachers.
I'll take the gadget one and I'll pass it to Jill for her opinion on whether or not to share, because it's a really interesting question and a lot of parents choose varying answers to share or not to share. So the quick answer for your device question is we do have a device. It's called Revibe. It's the second one. It's our newest version. It's called Revibe Connect. Essentially what it's doing is it's sending a reminder vibration to the child's wrist. It's actually learning, if you put in their schedule, their academic school day, actually starts to learn their needs for each class and for each part of the day, and starts to customize and personalize the vibrations so they're getting kind of just the right amount at just the right time. So when they get a vibration, they're just asking themselves, am I doing what I should be doing? And if I am, good job, and if I'm not, I need to get back to work. And we have a little screen on there that actually provides a reminder to the kids to tell them, to tap twice if they were on task, tap once if they were off task. And then we actually, so that in and of itself, we've seen it improve focus for different, kids to help get them back on task and to help with work completion. Have a homework mode and a reminder mode, so you can send little custom text messages to their wrist to remind them that now it's time to go back to their virtual learning session, or now it's time to take a break, because that they break from 12 to 12:30 every day for virtual learning. So it kind of frees you up to do more of your thing, whether it's parenting or your own work if you're working from home, and gives them some independence where they can actually start to take control of it in their own mind. The last cool thing I'll share about Revive before passing to Jill is we provide a lot of insights that are retrospective insights. And what that means is we collect a lot of data, both on their moving, their fidgeting. It presents metrics to you, like what was this child's, level of on-task behavior for this day or this class or this month. How much fidgeting were they doing? How much, fidgeting behaviors and minutes were they doing? And then we take all these numbers that we give you on a dashboard that you can look at, and it graphs it so you can understand how they're doing, and if there's any relationships between more fidgeting is better, or more steps are better, more caloric burn is better, etc. And what we do is we actually provide you guys these little pop-ups that'll come up once in a while that'll say, did you know that for your child, we realized after scanning this month's data or this week's data, that when they are getting to fidget, let's say for 10 minutes or more before social studies each day, that their attention span has been shown to be 4 or 5 minutes longer on average versus days they haven't had that opportunity? Or did you know that when Jennifer was able to walk 2,000 steps before her lunch break, her focus rate is improved by 22%. So we just give you some things so you can make better decisions about your child. Then we have a report you can share with the school and all that fun stuff. But that's Revive in a nutshell, so thank you for asking about that. And Jill, let me pass to you. What's your experience in terms of to divulge or not divulge if you do receive a diagnosis from your doctor to share with your school?
So that's ultimately a personal decision. I think when making that decision, my question would be, what do you need, or what do you want to get from the school system, from your child's teachers or whatever. Certainly, I think if the diagnosis has come about because the school had concerns and the teacher shared those with you, I would highly recommend sharing with them that the child has been diagnosed with ADHD. And again, like I said, if you feel like your child doesn't need any additional support at school, then that may be a time when you would choose not to share. Like, I don't think the school, they haven't said anything, they don't seem to notice, everything seems to be okay, we're just going to keep that to ourselves. But certainly if they are having difficulty or they need some kind of support, sharing that with the teacher will help the teacher and the other staff at the school know how to best support that child. It may be excuse me, it may be a matter that your child needs some kind of accommodations or modifications through a 504 plan, or they need specially designed instruction. So it's really about your comfort level with sharing with the teacher, and then what kind of support you feel like your child needs. At the elementary school level, you can certainly, typically your child has one teacher, you could start with that teacher. At the middle school or high school level, you may want to start with just a conversation with the guidance counselor and talk with him or her about the diagnosis, and kind of find out from their perspective if they've heard any concerns about your child, to help gauge your decision as to whether or not to share with the teachers, or if you need to go towards the 504 or IEP direction for school.
Couldn't have said it any better. Any more questions for Jill or I before we wrap up? I know we're about 8 minutes over time, but we really wanted to just share with you guys everything we thought would be helpful and valuable for you as parents.
Let's see. So there was another question from Bill. There was a mention earlier about getting input from the school psychologist when you suspect ADHD may be a concern. How useful is it to engage the school psychologist in the current remote learning environment? So that would be good for you. Yeah.
Great question, Bill. And I'd actually love to hear some feedback from Jill as well, as far as at least what our local school system here has been doing. I keep up with some of my peers who are school psychs, but it's been several weeks or months since we've really talked about what they're doing. But generally speaking, Bill, I think it's very helpful to get the school psychologist involved. They're going to wind up getting involved at some phase ultimately anyway, if the concern is great enough. So it's a really good idea to be proactive and just to give them some good kind of starting points. The school psychologist has the benefit of being able to collect a lot of data that your pediatrician just can't. Even if you have a fantastic psychiatrist or psychologist, they're not going to come into the school and observe your child in multiple settings, right? So the school psychologist is really helpful. And generally, in a perfect world, a COVID-free perfect world, I should characterize that, it's really helpful to be able to bring a report from your school psychologist to your pediatrician to say, we have all this data, that talks about a parent rating scale, a teacher rating scale, self-rating scale, with observations from this class, and then it just really provides kind of a wraparound whole picture of the child if it's coming from the school. Also, it can get processes started when you're working with the school in terms of if you do need special education or if you did need a 504 plan. So I always encourage moving forward. Let me pass to Jill. Jill, what is the current state of the union, if you will, on getting assessments going? Are they doing a lot of virtual assessments? How's that been going? I know at the time they were talking about bringing some school psychs in to do kind of careful evaluations with masks on both parties, but where are they at right now?
Right. So my understanding is that they are planning to start up virtual here in our area. At least they're planning to start up doing virtual assessments. But I think the first priority are referrals that we're behind on that would be from last school year. And I certainly think that what Rich was saying is great, to go ahead and start to have some of those conversations with the psychologist, the school psychologist, trying to do observations virtually. I don't think would be good information for a true just observation, because you're not able to see the child in the actual school environment. And there's just so much more opportunity, I think, and leeway for students to be distracted. But certainly the school psychologist can, reach back to, like I said, reach back to previous teachers. Were you seeing anything last year? Or it may be a child that the teacher had some concerns and reached out to the psychologist for suggestions on ways they could support. So I think just having some of that conversation and finding out, letting them help you with getting some of the legwork done with previous teachers and things that were being seen prior to being virtual, and have that bug planted for when we are back in person, to have your child on the list for an in-person observation would be great.
Perfect. Well, I think that was all our questions for today. Thank you guys so much for joining us. You can always reach out to us if we could ever be of any help, if any questions about things we've talked about. Again, we can't give medical advice, but we can always share any experiences we've had in the classroom or in the school system, and we're here to help. We want to be a resource for parents. So best of luck with everything that you guys are working through with COVID and with focus and attention challenges, and just let us know if we could be of any help at Revive.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.